On a cold morning in the winter of 1984, the manager of a popular fast food joint in eastern Pennsylvania slowly made his way up to the front door of the restaurant to unlock it. But when he grabbed the handle of the door, he found it was already unlocked. The manager was instantly worried, but then told himself that most likely one of his workers the night before must have just forgot to lock up. So the man just stepped through the door and headed past the cash registers towards the back office. But before he got to the back office, he stopped because there was something blocking his way. Something absolutely horrible. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go in to the Amazon Music follow button's JavaScript code and replace semicolons with Greek question marks. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was February of 1984, and 25-year-old Terry Brooks had just landed her perfect job. As the young woman with bright blue eyes and shoulder-length blonde hair backed her car out of her parents' driveway and headed west towards the Oxford Valley Mall, she glanced at her watch. Terry had always made a point of being on time, but as the brand-new assistant manager of a busy and popular fast food restaurant, she now made a point of arriving a little bit early. Not so early that she got underfoot of the waitstaff or appeared to be that over-eager manager who was looking over everybody's shoulders at how they were doing their jobs. But Terry had only been assigned to this Roy Rogers restaurant in Bucks County, Pennsylvania 1 week before, and so she wanted to make sure that she set a positive example as a capable, reliable manager who was friendly, but also very professional. As Terry drove the 13 miles from her parents' neat house in the quiet suburb of Warminster to the busy intersection of Route 1 and Oxford Valley Road in Fairless Hills, she hardly noticed the unusually warm weather, even though it was a surprising and welcome change from eastern Pennsylvania's typical chilly winter afternoons. In fact, Terry's life recently had been so busy and so full of changes and plans that the only remarkable thing about her commute to work was that it offered her a rare 30 minutes of quiet where she could try to organize her thoughts and prepare herself for the 10-hour shift ahead of her. It wasn't the actual work that Terry worried about. She already knew from past experience a lot about what went on inside of a restaurant. Ever since high school and right through the summers that she had spent home from college, Terry had done what most of her friends had also done, gotten summer jobs and part-time jobs as servers at local eateries. But once Terry had graduated from the University of Maryland almost 4 years ago with a degree in personnel management, she had decided to parlay that real-life work experience into a corporate job that would be a step closer to a professional career in the food service industry or in human resources. So, about 7 months earlier, back in July of 1983, Terry had left her longtime job as manager at a local Italian restaurant called Cucci's in her hometown of Warminster and taken a job with Roy Rogers, a chain of fast food restaurants that was owned by the Marriott Corporation, one of the country's giants in the hospitality industry. Even though the move meant that Terry would be taking an initial pay cut and that she would start with the Roy Rogers team not as a manager but as an assistant manager, Terry did not for a minute second-guess her decision to leave Cucci's. Because for Terry, taking charge of her life was something that came naturally. When her parents divorced back when Terry was in the 8th grade, the 4 Brooks children had gone to live with their father, George Brooks. Older than her 2 younger sisters and their youngest brother, Terry had immediately taken on more responsibility for her siblings. And even after her father had remarried, Terry was known to her family and friends for her dependability and her unwavering sense of purpose. As Terry's good friend, Cindy Bradney, who was a bartender at Cucci's restaurant, put it, Terry was one of the few people in their circle of friends in Warminster who had gone to college and who had come back home with a plan for going on to bigger and better things. But Terry's good looks and outstanding academic performance, along with her ambition and intelligence, was coupled with such genuine friendliness and kindness that she was more likely to inspire affection and trust than she was to inspire envy. And that was saying a lot, because in the early winter of 1984, it looked like Terry was living the kind of charmed life that everybody wants to have. After finishing college, Terry had made the difficult but very smart decision to end a serious relationship that had become strained and even physically abusive. And when Terry had fallen in love again, almost a year ago, it was with a 22-year-old local man who was a cook at Coochie's, where she used to work. Unlike Terry or her ex-boyfriend, Albert Scott Keefe, who went by his middle name, Scott, had not gone to college. But he was a hard worker, and he appreciated that combination of warmth and competence that made Terry really stand out from the crowd. Turning her attention away from the road just for a moment, Terry glanced down at the engagement ring on her left hand. She and Scott had known within weeks of meeting each other at Coochie's that their mutual attraction would lead to more than just a casual workplace romance. And sure enough, 3 months later, Scott had asked Terry to marry him, and with a radiant smile, Terry had said yes. Since then, the couple had been busy working and saving money for their upcoming wedding, which was planned for July 14th. With Scott living at his mom's house just 3 miles from where Terry was living with her parents, the two of them had just decided the week before that they could afford to put money down on a 10-day honeymoon to Hawaii. The moment the two of them had walked into the travel agency in nearby Doylestown, Pennsylvania 3 days ago, it had been both exciting and nerve-wracking. For Terry, the sight of the brochures that described Hawaii's sandy beaches, rugged coastlines, waterfalls, rainforests, and volcanoes suddenly made both the honeymoon and the wedding seem not only very real, but also very close. As Terry passed by the shops and strip malls and slices of farmland and cornfields that stretched out along either side of Route 132 East, she suddenly felt overwhelmed. There was so much to do and plan over the next 5.5 weeks, starting with the shopping trip she and her stepmother would make tomorrow to see if they could find a wedding gown for Terry. For Scott, Terry's career change also meant a few adjustments. Mostly that Terry's new job with Roy Rogers meant that they would no longer see each other every day at Coochie's, where they both used to work. But Terry and her family had appreciated the effort Scott made to check in on her now that she was working the night shift at a restaurant much further away from her home in Warminster. Although the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers was not located in a high-crime area, the clientele and overall vibe of the restaurant were very different from that of Coochie's. Instead of a local customer base and quiet location, Terry's Roy Rogers was stationed right at the intersection of two heavily used major roadways. By design, the fast food restaurant, with its Western theme and signature roast beef sandwiches, was a brightly lit, glass-sided cube of warmth and invitation that was intended to entice an endless stream of hungry travelers, many of whom would never return. But so far, any trouble that Terry had experienced at work had not come from customers. Instead, it had come from Roy Rogers' staff. 2 months earlier, while training at a different Roy Rogers, Terry had had a very nasty confrontation with an employee who outright refused to follow a simple order she had given him. Instead, Steve Daly blew up at her, called her terrible names, and became physically aggressive. Management had immediately fired this guy, but for a while, he still came back to the restaurant as a customer and sat glowering at Terry and her staff from one of the tables. More recently, at the Roy Rogers in Fairless Hills, her Roy Rogers, as she liked to remind herself, there had been an issue with one of the cash registers coming up $40 short at the end of a shift. Terry had had her suspicions about an employee named Barb who worked at her location, but soon after Terry had confronted her staff, the missing money had turned up, returned to the safe in an unmarked envelope. So it was probably no wonder, Terry thought to herself as she approached the intersection of North Oxford Road and US Route 1, that Scott was concerned about her safety, and often came to sit in the restaurant after closing to make sure she and any other late-night staff were not left there alone. Seeing the Roy Rogers sign in the distance, Terry reminded herself to call Scott later that evening and tell him that she'd be later than usual that night since she had to catch up on some important paperwork. As Terry turned on her car blinker and prepared to enter the Roy Rogers parking lot, she also made a mental note to let Scott know that she'd be fine. There was no need for him to come by and sit with her. It was Friday, February 3rd, and Terry knew Scott had an early shift the next morning, and there would be 2 teenagers staying there with her in the restaurant cleaning until about 1:30 a.m. So Scott didn't need to worry. Terry would not be alone. A minute later, and Terry had parked the car and turned off the engine. As she gathered her brown purse and slipped her car keys into the pocket of her light purple jacket, she glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. Straightening the collar of her Roy Rogers maroon dress shirt, Terry felt a thrill of accomplishment and hope. She'd only been working for the Marriott Corporation less than a year, but already Terry had learned so much about running a business and being a supervisor. And even the recent challenges had given her a chance to apply some of what she had learned in college about personnel management. And those conflicts had also been good practice on how to stand up for herself and be authoritative when it came to expressing expectations and consequences. A few minutes later, her blonde hair glowing under the light spilling out of the big glass windows of the wood-framed restaurant, Terry stepped up to the outer door leading into her Roy Rogers. At 6:45 a.m. the next morning, Saturday, February 4th, 1984, Scott was passing by Terry's parents' house on his way to work when he noticed that Terry's car was not parked in its usual spot in the Brooks' driveway. Puzzled, Scott slowed down. At 10 p.m. the night before, Terry had called him to say she'd be working late. Terry had been very busy, so their conversation was short, but Scott was sure he remembered every word correctly. "Honey, don't worry about me," Terry had told him. "I have some paperwork to finish tonight, but there are 2 other people that will be here with me." Coming to a sudden decision, Scott pulled his truck up to the curb. Despite the early hour, he decided to check in with Terry's parents just to make sure Terry had made it home okay the night before. Hopping out of his truck and heading for the front door of the house, Scott glanced at his watch. He was probably worrying for no reason, and he'd be back on the road in just a minute. And besides, even with the unplanned stop he was making, he'd still have enough time before his shift even started to enjoy a cigarette and a cup of coffee once he arrived at work. But a few minutes later, Scott was sitting down inside the Brooks kitchen, staring at Terry's parents with a stunned look on his face. Both Elizabeth and George Brooks had just checked Terry's bedroom and found that it was empty. The bed was made, and there was no sign anywhere in the house of their oldest daughter. As Terry's 51-year-old father stepped to the kitchen phone and dialed the number of the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers restaurant 30 minutes away, Scott pushed himself slowly to his feet, and he and Terry's mother, Elizabeth, leaned forward, straining to hear the voice on the other end of the line. The call was answered by a police officer. 1 hour earlier, at about 6 a.m., the manager of the Fairless Hills, Roy Rogers, had arrived, as he always did on Saturday mornings, to open up the restaurant and get things ready for the breakfast shift. It wasn't until Joseph Hampton reached the front door and found it unlocked that he had the first inkling that something might be wrong. There was a second inner door to the restaurant that stayed open during business hours, but locked automatically when staff closed it behind them and left for the night. But this outer door had to be locked using a key, and obviously someone had failed to do that. Suddenly alert, the manager stepped inside, unlocked the second door, and turned to look at the tables and booths in the dining area. Seeing that nothing appeared to be out of order, he relaxed slightly as he stepped behind the counter with its bank of cash registers into the small rectangular prep area in the entryway to the kitchen. That's when he stopped. In a faint glow of light shining out from the partially closed office door ahead of him, the manager could just make out the shape of a human body. Terry Brooks lay on her back on the red tiled floor. Dressed in her short purple winter coat, her purse and keys and shoes were all scattered in the space around her. Standing there in the semi-darkness, it took Joseph a moment to recognize who she was, because Terry's head was completely wrapped in one of the big plastic bags that should have been lining the nearby trash can, and just below the bag, there was the wooden handle of a butcher knife sticking out of Terry's throat. Within minutes of receiving Joseph's frantic 911 call at 6:12 a.m., the first officers and emergency medical personnel from the Falls Township Police Department were rolling into the Roy Rogers parking lot, lights flashing and officers already preparing to close off the perimeter of the restaurant with yellow crime scene tape. When Terry's father called Roy Rogers' restaurant that morning at about 7 a.m., his wife Elizabeth would later remember every word of the short exchange. "This is George Brooks, Terry Brooks' father. Terry didn't come home last night. Is she okay?" George's wife and Terry's fiancé did not have to strain to hear the police officer's answer. "No, she's not. She's been murdered." It did not take the lead detectives on the case very long to form a theory of what had happened inside the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers restaurant in the early hours of Saturday, February 4th. Because not only was Terry Brooks dead with no sign that she had been sexually assaulted, but also the store safe had been left wide open and more than $2,700 was missing. To detectives George Mitchell and Tim Stefan, that and everything else about the scene and the likely time of the murder pointed to a robbery homicide. According to early interviews with restaurant staff, Terry had sent two teenagers who had given the restaurant its final cleaning home at about 1:30 a.m. And even though restaurant protocol required a minimum of 2 staff in the restaurant at closing, Terry had decided to stay a little longer by herself to finish her paperwork. Then, dressed to leave work in her coat with her purse and keys in hand, police theorized that Terry's attacker may have waited for her outside and gained entry to the safe and money by pushing Terry back inside the restaurant as she was leaving. If Terry had fought back, the robber may have panicked and killed her. Police also considered the possibility that someone had entered the restaurant before it closed and had hidden somewhere inside with the intent of robbing the safe. In either scenario, robbery and money were the primary motives, and Terry, tragically, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it wasn't just the crime scene that suggested this had been a robbery gone wrong. It was this particular robbery against a backdrop of other recent robberies in the same region. During the last several months, law enforcement in and around Bucks County, Pennsylvania, had received so many reports of restaurants being burglarized that police and the media had nicknamed the perpetrator or perpetrators the Freezer Bandits. But given the brutality of Terry's murder, police also considered the possibility that there was a personal element to the crime, and that one of Terry's co-workers was the robber, and they had disliked her enough that, finding her inside the restaurant, they decided to kill her. Even as crime scene techs were busy gathering physical evidence at Roy Rogers, and the deputy coroner was collecting evidence from Terry's body, police investigators were at the Brooks residence out in Warminster, taking statements from Scott and Terry's parents. Since the majority of homicides are committed by a spouse or partner, Scott was an obvious person of interest. But there was nothing in Scott's story or in statements from Terry's friends and family that suggested he had a motive or connection to the crime. Terry's mother confirmed that her daughter had called Scott at about 10 p.m. the night before to say she was working late and he didn't need to stop by, and according to Elizabeth, there was nothing to indicate that the couple had quarreled or that the phone conversation was anything other than affectionate. And there was nothing in the couple's recent behavior that suggested trouble. Just 3 days earlier, Scott and Terry had paid for their honeymoon to Hawaii, and on the day of her murder, Terry and her stepmom had been looking forward to going shopping together for Terry's wedding gown. Where police did see red flags was in the description they heard from family and friends about Terry's relationship with her ex-boyfriend. And at the same time that investigators were tracking down that lead and corroborating the statements of Scott and Terry's family and friends, detectives interviewing Terry's co-workers quickly learned about Terry's confrontation 2 months ago with Steve Daly that had led to him being fired. And they also heard about the more recent incident involving the $40 missing from one of the Roy Rogers cash registers. But it wasn't long before Township Falls investigators pursuing all of these various leads began running into one dead end after another. In quick succession, they eliminated Terry's old boyfriend as well as Steve Daly from the suspect list. The ex-boyfriend had moved to California and had an airtight alibi. As for Steve Daly, he also had an alibi and he passed a lie detector test. Another Roy Rogers employee, whose fingerprints were found on the sill of the drive-through window that Terry's attacker had almost certainly used as an escape route, as well as on the plastic bag that was wrapped around Terry's head, also passed a lie detector test. And in addition to having an alibi, the presence of that employee's fingerprints was explained by the fact that he had worked at the drive-through window and that he had also placed the bag wrapped around Terry's head into the trash can, from which the bag had later been removed. It wasn't until late February and early March that the investigation suddenly regained momentum. That's when 2 more female workers at fast food restaurants within a 100-mile radius of Fairless Hills were attacked in separate incidents. Both crimes appeared to be robberies, and at one of the restaurants, the young woman was stabbed to death. But the man arrested for that murder turned out to have no connection to Terry's death. And by the end of March, police had also captured the so-called freezer bandits and determined that they too had no connection to Terry's death. By July 14, 1984, the date set for Terry and Scott to get married, the investigation into the murder of Terry Brooks had gone cold. Despite a $5,000 reward from the Marriott Corporation for information that would lead to the arrest of Terry's murderer, and despite asking for help from law enforcement in other states, as well as from the FBI, and at the request of Terry's family, even consulting 3 psychics, the Falls Township Police Department had run out of leads, suspects, and the resources necessary to continue the investigation. Over the next 10 years, Terry's family suffered. George Brooks's hair turned white, his cheeks lost their fullness, and his smile, so like his daughter Terry's, rarely appeared on his face. George had bought Scott a new suit to wear to Terry's funeral, which was held on February 8, 1984, when there was still so many leads in the investigation into Terry's murder that police were practically working around the clock. But after that service, as the investigation stalled, the Brooks family lost touch with Scott. And a decade later, Scott would eventually marry and go on to have a child. With Terry's 3 siblings to take care of, George and Elizabeth Brooks also did their best to move forward. But they never stopped checking in with investigators to see if there was any new information about their daughter's murder. Finally, in 1990, the Brooks hired a lawyer to file a wrongful death lawsuit against the Marriott Corporation. This kind of lawsuit seeks compensation for the emotional loss of a victim's family or survivors, like lost companionship. And these kinds of lawsuits are also very hard to win. But for the Brooks, the purpose of this lawsuit was not to get money. It was to get investigators for both sides to do their own digging into Terry's murder to see if the wrongful death claim had any legal merit. In 1990, investigators for the Brooks attorney handed their report over to local law enforcement, and at some point, that report was added to the stack of documents marked Terry Brooks that sat gathering dust in the Township Falls Police Storage Unit. But on May 22, 1998, 14 years after Terry's body had been discovered on the floor in the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers restaurant, the investigation into her murder was back in the media spotlight. The day before, on the 3rd Thursday of the month, 82 well-dressed men and women could all be seen climbing the stone steps of a large Victorian brownstone located in the heart of downtown Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Each person entering the Old City Tavern wore a distinctive red, white, and blue rosette pinned to their chest, and each one was a member of a very select group of crime investigators who were well known in law enforcement circles, but unknown to the general public. This was a regular meeting of the VDUC Society, a unique crime-fighting organization co-founded 8 years earlier by 3 nationally recognized forensic investigators. Named after Eugene Vidocq, a French detective who is considered the father of modern crime investigation, its members select and review cold cases brought to them by law enforcement agencies, offering fresh perspectives that might help kickstart a stalled investigation. On the agenda for that cool and cloudy Thursday afternoon was a 1-hour slideshow by Falls Township Police Sergeant Wynn Cloud that would present all the evidence police had gathered during their failed 1984 investigation into the death of 25-year-old Terry Brooks. Sergeant Cloud had recently been promoted by the township's new police chief to head up the department's detective division. At the same time, Chief Arnie Connelline had also ordered Sergeant Cloud to start reviewing cold cases, and the first case on that list was Terry Brooks. So, after the VDUC Society members, one for every 82 years of Eugene Vidocq's life, had finished their formal lunch and were waiting for dessert, a very nervous Detective Cloud stepped up to the podium at the front of the grand dining room, a slide projector on the table next to him, and a large silver projection screen behind him. And over the next 60 minutes, VDUC Society investigators saw images of the 90 pieces of physical evidence and pictures that had been collected from the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers where Terry had been killed. These slides included fingerprints, Terry's bloodied purple jacket, the butcher knife sticking out of her throat, the contents of her purse scattered across the floor around her, the defensive wounds on Terry's hands and arms, the drive-through window where the murderer had fled the scene of the crime, and a picture of the blood and tissue, assumed to be that of her attacker, that had been scraped from underneath Terry's fingernails. Back in 1984, when Terry was killed, an examination of that blood and tissue would not have revealed the identity of the killer. But since then, a lot had changed in forensic science. And now, in 1998, if police could find a suspect whose DNA profile matched a DNA analysis of those samples, police would have the breakthrough on this case that they needed. But first, they needed to find that suspect. When the presentation was over, members of the Vidux Society had harsh words for the original team that investigated Terry's murder. It wasn't that the detectives back in 1984 weren't working night and day to solve a case that had produced enough statements to fill 3 large cardboard boxes. The problem, according to forensic psychologist Richard Walter, was that investigators had misinterpreted the crime scene. Instead of focusing on the robbery angle, right from the start, detectives should have been focusing on the extreme violence of the murder itself. Putting down his fork and pushing aside his plate of thick-crusted apple pie, one of the 3 founders of the Vidux Society went on to tell Sergeant Cloud that even though the case was 14 years old, the murder itself had already revealed a great deal of information about the killer. But police would need to begin the whole investigation over from scratch, starting with a DNA analysis of the tissue sample collected from under Terry's fingernails. And then Dr. Walters told police the 2 key questions that would lead them to discover the identity of Terry's murderer. Over the next 4 months, 32-year-old Falls Township detective Nelson Whitney took the lead on the new investigation into the Terry Brooks homicide, ordering a complete DNA analysis of blood, hair, and tissue samples found at the crime scene. Then, with the help of the Vidux Society and a profile of the killer developed by Richard Walter, investigators re-interviewed Terry's parents, former co-workers, and friends of Terry who had not been interviewed during the first investigation. Investigators also combed through the funeral register that listed the names of people who had attended Terry's memorial service back on February 8, 1984, trying to track down the phone numbers and addresses of possible witnesses or suspects. And then, buried in the old files, Detective Whitney discovered the report that had been done 8 years earlier by the investigators who had been hired to look into the wrongful death lawsuit Terry's parents had filed back in 1990. That report, along with an interview with Terry's friend, Sidney Bradney, the bartender at Coochie's restaurant where Terry and she had worked before Terry took the job at Roy Rogers, eventually led investigators to the suspect they'd been looking for. The challenge now was how to link this person to the crime and get a written confession. 1 month later, early one morning in October of 1998, Detective Nelson sat in an unmarked police car staking out a modest home that had become as familiar to him as his own house. It was trash day, and Detective Whitney had already seen the residents of this particular house put their bag of trash out at the curb. The detective also knew that the moment they dropped it there by the street, whatever was inside that bag was no longer considered their own private property. Instead, anyone who wanted to rummage around in that trash or take something out of the trash and keep it was legally free to do so. The investigator tensed when he heard the rumble of the garbage collection truck coming down the road behind him. Watching the truck in his rearview mirror, the young detective put his hand on the inside handle of the driver's side car door. And as soon as the garbage truck slowed to a stop and one of the workers hopped down and picked up that bag of trash in front of the house that Detective Whitney had been watching, the detective was out of his car and across the street. By prior arrangement with the garbage collection company, the detective took the bag directly from the gloved hand of the sanitation worker, carried it back to his car, tossed it into the trunk, jumped inside the car, and drove off to the Falls Township Police Station. With any luck, that bag of trash would contain a DNA sample from their suspect that would line up with the DNA of the tissue collected 14 years earlier from Terry's dead body. And sure enough, a smear of saliva scraped off the butt of one of the discarded cigarettes inside that trash bag would turn out to be a solid match. And on the evening of February 4th, 1998, on the 14th anniversary of Terry's murder, police knocked on the door of the house where the suspect lived. Based on the new information police had learned from Terry's friend, Cindy, coupled with the information the police would learn directly from the suspect over the course of the next 6 hours, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Terry Brooks in the early morning hours of that Saturday 14 years ago, in the minutes just before she left work at her Roy Rogers restaurant in Fairless Hills. As Terry drove to work on the evening of Friday, February 3rd, 1984, she thought about her conversation the week before with her good friend Cindy. At the time they had talked, Terry had been so distressed that she practically broke down in tears. But now, a few days later, while Terry still felt upset, she also felt like she knew what she had to do to make things right. It wouldn't be easy, but as Terry was learning very quickly, she just needed to accept that other people were not always going to agree with or welcome every decision she made. By the time Terry had pulled into the parking lot of the Fairless Hills Roy Rogers, she told herself it was time to stop worrying and turn her attention instead to the work shift ahead of her. A few minutes later, and Terry was stepping out of the foggy darkness into the brightly lit and cheerful interior of the restaurant. And after that, Terry didn't have time to worry even if she wanted to, because the next 8 hours flew by. First in a rush of food orders and the clatter of plates and silverware, and then, after the restaurant closed to the public, in the bustle of staff cleaning up and getting ready to leave for the night. By the time Terry had locked the glass doors behind the two-person cleaning crew that left at 1:30 a.m., she had almost finished with her paperwork. And a half hour after that, and Terry was more than ready to go home. It had been a long day and night, and she was looking forward to sleeping late that morning. Pulling on her short winter jacket and reaching for her brown purse, Terry glanced around the office to make sure everything was in its place for the next day. But just when Terry was about to turn out the office light and leave, she stopped, sure that she had just heard a knock on the front door of the restaurant. Slipping her purse over her shoulder and gripping her set of keys in her free hand, Terry stepped through the kitchen prep area so she could peek out into the parking lot. Recognizing the person standing outside, Terry relaxed, but only slightly. Letting out a deep breath, she walked forward to open the doors for her unexpected visitor. Half an hour earlier, when the two-person cleaning crew had left Roy Rogers, Terry's killer had already been watching the restaurant from the parking lot next door for 30 minutes. Even without the car engine and heater running, the night was so unseasonably warm that inside of the car was still comfortable. Not that the killer would have noticed anyway. There were more important things to think about, like how Terry deserved everything that she had coming to her. Seeing her lock the door behind the two teenagers and disappear back into the dimly lit kitchen area, the killer reached over to the pack of Newports lying on the passenger seat. There was just enough time for one more cigarette. At 2 a.m., the killer had left their vehicle and was knocking on the front door of Roy Rogers. A few minutes later, the killer had followed Terry towards the back of the restaurant until they were both standing on the red-tiled floor just outside of the kitchen. Only now, the two of them weren't just talking, they were arguing. And this time, Terry was not backing down. And in response to what Terry had to say, Terry's killer suddenly stepped forward and hit Terry in the face. The blow was so hard, it literally lifted Terry out of her moccasin-style shoes and sent her flying. She landed flat on her back, her keys and the contents of her purse skittering off in every direction. And that was just the beginning. Once Terry was on the floor, her attacker straddled her body and began choking her and pounding her head against the floor. Then, the killer reached up to grab a 7-inch-long butcher knife from one of the tables above them. The autopsy report later showed that Terry would suffer not one, but several fatal injuries. In addition to brain hemorrhage, a broken bone in her throat, and a crushed voice box, Terry would be stabbed 20 times in the face, neck, and torso, as well as beaten with a length of lead pipe. But even as she was dying, Terry fought back. After her attacker had stabbed the knife once through her neck, Terry threw her hands and arms up to protect herself, and in doing that, her fingernails dragged along the surface of the attacker's skin. It wasn't until the second knife strike severed Terry's spinal cord and left her paralyzed that she finally lay still, her arms falling outstretched to either side of her body. The tip of the knife had dug so deeply into the floor that Terry's throat was pinned to the hard red tiles. Unable to scream or move, Terry stared up into the face of her killer. Still, it wasn't over. Breathing heavily with excitement, Terry's killer got up off the floor and, stepping to the nearby trash can, pulled out the clear plastic bag that lined the bin. Returning to where Terry lay trapped, her killer bent down and wrapped the bag around her head, and then watched as Terry's final breaths created a film of condensation inside the suffocating layers of plastic. A minute later, the killer had turned away, cracked open the door of the safe, and gathered up all the bills inside. Then, with a last look around, the killer pushed open the drive-through window, climbed over the sill, and dropped down onto the pavement below before running at a crouch back to the adjacent parking lot. There was the sound of a car engine starting, and then the killer was turning out onto Route 1 to head home. 14 years later, these two questions that forensic psychologist Richard Walter asked at the May 21st meeting of the VDUC Society would in fact lead police straight to Terry's killer. The first question was, who would Terry trust and know well enough to let into the restaurant at 2 a.m. the morning she died? And the second question was, who had such intense feelings for Terry that their attack would have been brutal enough to kill her several times over? There was only one answer: Terry's devoted fiancé, Albert Scott Keefe. It would turn out that when police reopened the investigation into Terry's death, Terry's friend, Cindy Bradney, would tell investigators that just the week before Terry was killed, Terry had confided that she was thinking of calling off her July 14th wedding. 8 months into her engagement, Terry had begun to have serious second thoughts about spending her life with Scott. It turned out he had a bad temper, and he was jealous and very possessive of Terry. Terry had begun to feel that the real reason he came to sit with her at Roy Rogers while she closed the restaurant had less to do with concern over her safety and more to do with ungrounded suspicions that she might be seeing other people. Scott also had money problems, and so he was angry when Terry left Coochie's restaurant, where they both worked, for a lower-paying job at Roy Rogers. When Terry had walked into the Doylestown travel agency with Scott 3 days before she was killed and paid for the couple's honeymoon, Terry may have realized that the time had come to end her engagement or delay the wedding before it was too late. And according to Dr. Walter and other VDUC Society members who would later review the investigation into Terry's murder, the safe at Roy Rogers may have been robbed, but the real motive for Terry's death had never been money. Instead, this had been a complex and personal murder committed by someone driven by both anger and retaliation. Someone who would rather kill Terry many times over than allow her to walk away from their relationship. Everything else about the crime, the robbery, jumping out of the drive-through window, Scott appearing later that morning at the Brooks' house full of concern over not seeing Terry's car in the driveway, all of that had been pure misdirection. But now, 14 years later, on February 4th, 1998, armed with the DNA from one of Scott's discarded Newport cigarette butts that was tied to the hair and tissue found at the crime scene, investigators finally had the physical evidence they needed to bring Scott into the police station for questioning. By then, Scott and his wife were divorced, and Scott's life seemed to have come full circle. He was once again living with his mother in Warminster and working at an Italian pizzeria the next town over. Confronted with the new DNA evidence, new witness statements that described serious tensions in Scott's relationship with Terry, and the fact that he had failed a lie detector test, in the early hours of February 5th, 1998, Scott confessed to the murder of Terry Brooks. In a final twist to a case that had now captured national attention, police also revealed that the report filed by investigators looking into the wrongful death lawsuit the Brooks had filed back in 1990 had also listed Scott Keefe as the most likely person to have murdered Terry. The report also included the witness statement that placed Scott in the parking lot adjacent to Roy Rogers about an hour before Terry was killed. Almost 2 years later, on Monday, June 5th, 2000, 37-year-old Scott Keefe was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Terry's father, George Brooks, died before Scott's trial, succumbing to a long illness just 15 months after he was informed that Scott had been arrested for killing his daughter. In February of 2000, 4 months before Scott's trial, Terry's family won its wrongful death lawsuit against Marriott Corporation. The $675,000 settlement was divided between attorneys and Terry's estate. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please go in to the Amazon Music follow button's JavaScript code and replace semicolons with Greek question marks. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's story comes out of China, and it is a brutal story. There's just no way to tell it without being graphic. So with that in mind, this is definitely a mature audiences only type of story. That said, it is a fascinating story, and the ending is something that very few of you are going to see coming. It's going to feel kind of predictable throughout most of the story, and then it's like the end completely changes your entire impression of the story. It's wild. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to power wash the Amazon Music follow button's house, but be sure to set the machine all the way up so you blow off all their shingles and blast the paint off their house, and then just leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. One Saturday afternoon in November of 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Sue Lixia sat crying on a bench at a train station in the city of Naha, which is located in northeastern China. Sue had just left her husband for good. They'd had a bad marriage for a long time. It was very contentious. They fought all the time. And that morning, they had gotten into this major fight. And for Sue, it was kind of like the final straw. And so she just stormed into the bedroom, grabbed some things, threw it in a bag, and just stormed out. She was done. But Sue really didn't have a plan for what she was going to do once she left the house. And so she found herself just sitting at this train station doing nothing, just staring at the trains rolling in and out over and over again. And as she sat there, again, not knowing what she's going to do, she suddenly took stock of the fact that very few people were getting on and off of these trains. And in fact, the train station itself was weirdly vacant. So the city of Naha, where Sue was actually fairly small by China's standards, even though there was 70,000 people that lived there. The city sat at the base of this towering mountain, and then all around the city in the outskirts was basically just farmland with lots of soy and corn crops. And then as you move closer to the city center, there were lots of things you would expect to see in a city, like tall buildings and, residential and commercial areas. But overall, Naha was just kind of boring. It's like the city was a city, even if it was small, but there was just not much going on. And in fact, if you lived in China, but not in Naha, there was a very good chance you didn't know Naha even existed, like it was kind of irrelevant. However, in the last few months leading up to this moment that Sue is sitting at this train station, the city of Naha had suddenly been put on the map, and everybody knew about this city because women from Naha were going missing in droves. In fact, Sue herself knew of at least a dozen women who had gone missing over the past few months from Naha. And as these women started going missing, it was making the news all over the country, and women who lived in Naha were acutely aware of the risks of being out alone, in fear that somebody was going to come snatch them up and take them away. In fact, every time Sue would go to work, she would make sure she would walk with other women, like in pairs, to ensure safety. This was a really scary time if you were a woman living in Naha. However, the caveat to the missing women was all of them to this point, when Sue was sitting at the train station, had been sex workers. And Sue, she thought, in virtue of not being a sex worker and instead being a kindergarten teacher, that somehow she was not actually that vulnerable to being snatched up or, whatever was happening to these women, she just felt like it wouldn't happen to her. But now, as Sue sat at this train station, which again was eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here. She felt like she could easily become the next woman who went missing from Naha. And so Sue began to think, maybe I should just go back home and try to patch things up with my husband, mostly for her safety, just to go back inside her home and be safe again. But before she could stand up to do that, she noticed on the other end of the platform, this man who was exceptionally well dressed with this beautiful brown wool coat and fancy pants. He looked like he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. He came up onto the train platform, and without saying a word, he walked slowly down the platform all the way to where Sue was, and he reached into his pocket and he held out a tissue to her because he saw she was crying. And Sue, she's looking up at the sky, and again, there's nobody else here, and she's very much on edge, and she doesn't know what to do. It was already creepy that this place was vacant, but it's even stranger to have a random man come up to her and try to initiate some sort of interaction with her. It just felt wrong and weird and very suspicious. But as Sue stared at the sky, trying to figure out what his angle was, she could see that he had kind of kept himself standing back from her, kind of a respectful distance, not trying to crowd her out. And he was looking at her with a very sympathetic look on his face, and he's holding this tissue out, and he said to her, "Are you okay?" And he hands the tissue again, like, "Please take it." And there was just something about this guy that felt very sincere, and Sue kind of let her guard down, and she accepted the tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes. She didn't say anything, and then this guy, he said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" And at this point, Sue said, "Yeah, okay, you can sit down." And so this very handsome, well-dressed man took a seat next to Sue, not right next to her, again, respectful distance from her. And again, he asked her, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And for Sue, whose life had been basically miserable the last few months or even years with this terrible marriage she was in, she wasn't used to being asked if she was okay. And this man, who she didn't know, had caught her at this very vulnerable moment in her life. And it was like all her emotions just came pouring out. And she began sobbing hysterically, telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned her family and she had no idea what she was going to do. And finally, when Sue stopped telling this guy all about her problems, she felt very embarrassed and kind of looked up at him like she was sorry for even saying as much. But the man, who was very intently listening, he was just nodding along, very sympathetic, and he told Sue that his name was Gia Wang, and that he was a director at a factory not far from here, and if she was open to it, he'd be happy to think about hiring her at the factory, give her a new start potentially, because it seemed like that's what she really needed. And then he asked her if she wanted to come back to his house to discuss this job opportunity further. Now with this, even though Sue had really appreciated everything this guy had done to this point, the second he asked her to come back to his house, she's like, red flags are going up. She knew there's something off here. Clearly this guy does have an angle and it's not to benefit me. And so she looked at him with an absolutely suspicious look, like, no way am I going to your house. I don't know you. Like, I appreciate the tissue and you letting me cry, but there's no way. But again, as she's staring at him with the suspicious look, the look on Gia's face remained very sympathetic and very gentle. And it almost seemed like he was just going to get up and go, like, hey, I'm sorry for offending you. But before he did get up to leave, Sue said, hold on. Actually, yes, I'll come with you. She didn't know why she agreed to go with him. Maybe it was because her life was so messed up at this point that she was just kind of ready to take chances and be sort of reckless. And this was definitely that. Big chance, very reckless. But again, she just felt like, there's something sincere about this guy and she felt like she could trust him. And so Sue and Gia stood up and together they walked down the train platform, not saying much. They went downstairs, they went out to the street, and they walked a couple of blocks to where Gia's street was. And as soon as they turned the corner and he showed Sue which house was his, Sue looked up, and whatever hesitations she had had still to that point about following the stranger to his house were gone, because she saw his house was beautiful. It wasn't that it was so grand or anything, it totally fit with the neighborhood, but it was very well maintained and totally felt on brand for a guy who was so well dressed and so well manicured and frankly so handsome. So Gia led the way to the front door of his house. He unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he gently gestured for Sue to come on inside. And so she did. She walked past him. Gia followed her in, and the two of them took off their shoes and made their way into the kitchen, where Gia brewed some tea for them, and then they both sat down and began to sip their tea and talk about this job opportunity. And so for a few minutes, Gia is telling Sue all about the role and what she might be doing, and Sue is kind of asking general questions about it, but, for the most part, she just kind of enjoyed being in the presence of somebody who seemed to care about her. But after she finished her entire glass of tea, suddenly Gia, who had been talking this whole time about the factory, just stopped. It was like he was waiting for her to drink that entire drink. And as soon as she was done with her cup, Gia, again, he went quiet and just stared at Sue with this kind of sinister look on his face, like he was very pleased with what was going on. And at that point, Sue looked down at her teacup and then back at Gia. Then suddenly she began to feel very drowsy. It was like her vision was beginning to go, and she realized Gia clearly had poisoned her. There was something inside of her tea. And so before she could do anything, everything went black. A couple of weeks later, just a few blocks away from where Sue met Gia at the train station, a police officer named Zhang was standing behind his desk at the police station when a very concerned-looking elderly couple came inside. Now, this couple was here to speak with Zhang about a missing person, but the missing person was not Sue. She had been missing for 2 weeks now. Nobody had seen her, but no one had reported her missing. Her husband had just assumed that Sue had left him, and that's why he hadn't seen her, and so he had naturally not reported that. And again, nobody else knew she was missing, so keep that in mind. Officer Zhang has no idea about Sue and Gia, none of it. But when this elderly couple came in to make a missing person report, Officer Zhang was not the least bit surprised. It was now December of 1990, and over the past 6 months, 20 women out of Naha had suddenly gone missing. Remember, Sue is not one of those 20. The 20 are mostly sex workers who went missing at that same train station where Sue met Gia. And so Officer Zhang was used to making all these missing person reports, but candidly, the police actually felt like, because these were sex workers that were going missing, they weren't sure if they were actually being abducted or if they were simply getting on a train and kind of leaving town to go work somewhere else. And so really, there wasn't a whole lot of investigation happening to figure out why so many of these women were going missing. But again, Officer Zhang, he's not surprised that they're telling him they want to file a missing person report. But when Zhang took this elderly couple to an interview room to talk to them about whoever was missing in their lives, when this couple spoke, Officer Zhang knew this was different, because the couple was not reporting another missing woman from Naha who also happened to be a sex worker. Instead, they were reporting that a man was missing, a businessman. However, the details of his disappearance sounded eerily similar to all these sex working women who had also gone missing. This guy was last seen at that same train station where Sue had met Gia, and then nobody had seen him, and so that's why they were here. And so Officer Zhang, he wrote up their report, and then he told the couple that, very likely this man is okay, and he'll show up at some point under his own steam, but he told them the police would look into it, and they'd be in touch. However, as this couple got up and turned around and left, Officer Zhang couldn't help but feel like this missing man and all these missing women went missing from the same place. And it's the same city and it's the same pattern over and over again, but now we have a man. And even though Zhang wanted to write it off as an anomaly, he started to wonder if this missing man was connected to all these missing women. Because by January of 1991, so 2 months after Sue had gone missing without a trace and still had not been reported by anybody, and 6 weeks after that elderly couple reported that man missing, another 5 people from Naha had gone missing, 2 more women and 3 more men. And so now the police in Naha were looking at 26 people, men and women, that had all gone missing very recently out of Naha, and nobody had a clue what happened to them. And importantly, because now there were men who were not sex workers who were going missing, the police couldn't just write this whole thing off as, these sex working women are just going to another city to go do their work there. Like that was not a possibility anymore. Clearly something bad was happening, and the police knew they really needed to do a real investigation here. So finally, in early spring of that year, the police in Naha formed a task unit and legitimately began investigating all these disappearances. But amazingly, there was no information. There was nothing. These people went missing and nobody heard from them. There was no evidence of where they went. There was not even any sign that anything bad happened to them because no bodies had been found. There was no evidence of really anything happening. All the police knew is these 26 people, not including Sue, so she would be the 27th person, had been at this train station and then vanished. And that's all they knew. And it got to the point where this story really began to spread around China, and it became like this running joke that if you don't want to live, go to Naha. Because everybody assumed there had to be some sort of serial killer or something happening there who was just roaming the streets, picking people off. And then by late summer of 1991, when really this story had taken hold across the country and was becoming a bigger and bigger deal because there was absolutely no resolution here, police had no idea what was going on, well, the whole situation got a whole lot worse because now, in addition to people suddenly vanishing at the train station in Naha, more people were also going missing in other cities nearby Naha, but all along the same train line that left out of Naha. So more train stations, more disappearances all around the area, not just the city of Naha, but all around. And by the fall of that year, when over 30 people had gone missing all the same way from these train stations all around Naha, the police still had absolutely nothing to go on. All they had is, here are these people, here's where they were, they vanished, we got nothing else, no bodies, no evidence, nothing. But all that would change on October 22nd, 1991, roughly a year after Sue met Gia at the train station in Naha and then drank that drugged tea. On that October day in 1991, so again, a year after the disappearance of Sue, police at this train station, 1,700 miles away from the city of Naha, were doing random stops of commuters on the train platform. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation into all these missing people. This was just like public safety stuff, where the police were kind of just walking around, looking for people who looked suspicious, and then checking in on them to make sure they weren't doing anything illegal. And on this particular day, at this train station far away from Naha, one of these officers spotted this very handsome guy in a beautiful brown wool coat and very fancy pants and shoes. And he stood out a lot because of, frankly, how beautiful he was. And so the police officer saw him, and this very handsome guy looked up and he saw the police officer, and it was like immediately he did something very suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a bag, and quickly turned around and began walking away. And at the same time, two other people who were right near this very handsome guy did the same thing. They grabbed bags off the ground, quickly turned around, fell in line with this handsome guy, and began quickly walking away from the police. And so the police obviously are totally suspicious. They run across the platform and they manage to stop all three of them, and they turn them around and they say, "Show me your bags, open them up." And the police, they would open up these bags and they contain drugs. And so right away, these three know they are caught, but they don't say anything. They just stand there and they're totally silent as the police are asking them, like, what are these drugs? Where are you going with these? What's going on here? They're not talking. And so finally the police go, "Give me your IDs right now." And so all three of them cough up their IDs, and the very handsome guy with the beautiful brown wool coat and fancy clothes, well, that was Gia Wang. The same Gia Wang who had gone with Sue into his house and given her the drugged tea. But again, these police officers are only concerned about the drugs. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know that Gia met Sue and did this thing at his house with the tea. That wasn't even reported to police. Nobody knew about it. But these police knew they had caught these three people with these bags of illegal drugs, so they brought them back to the station and began to question each of them. And when they spoke to Gia, Gia said nothing. However, when they spoke to the two other people that were with Gia, one of them began to crack. It was obvious they had more to tell about these drugs, and they were kind of holding back tears, like they were very upset. And one of the interrogators, sensing one of these people was prepared to confess to something, instead of really drilling down on them, he was very comforting, and he offered them a blanket and said, "Here, take this blanket, relax, it's okay. You can tell me what's on your mind, it's okay." And that just totally broke this person. And they said, "These drugs are nothing. You need to see what's in Gia's house. That will put these drugs to the side. They won't matter. What's in his house is horrible." The next day, a phone rang in the police station in Naha, and Officer Zhang picked it up, And it was one of the officers who interviewed these 3 people with drugs and got this whole horrible confession about what was inside of this guy Jia's house. And he told Zhang all about it. And as Zhang is listening to this, his eyes went wide because he knew this had to be connected to all these people going missing. Like, this has to be it. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, Officer Zhang rounded up 20 other police officers and 10 forensic doctors to go search Jia's house. And when they got there, the house from the outside looked just as beautiful as when Sue had seen it for the first time and felt like her reservations about Jia had gone down because of how wonderful his house looked. But as soon as all those police officers and the forensic doctors stepped inside of Jia's house, he wasn't home, there was nobody there. When they went inside, they were instantly hit with this horrible, horrible smell inside the house. Even though things are neat and beautiful inside too, there was something bad inside this house. And the smell seemed to be coming from the basement. And so at some point, Officer Zhang and the other officers, they got to the door, they opened it up, and they looked down, and all they could see was just this dark room down there. And the smell was so strong, but they pulled their shirts up over their faces, and they went down the stairs. And when they got down there, they couldn't see anything. It's totally dark. But the smell at this point was so overpowering that a couple of the officers almost fainted. And so literally they had to leave the house fearing they were breathing in toxic chemicals or something. And they had to wear gas masks just to go back into the house and back down into the basement. And when they got back down there, now wearing their masks, and at first, it didn't seem like there was anything down there that could produce such an awful smell. Like there was just nothing down there. But eventually, one of the officers moved to the middle of the basement, right in the middle, and they realized there was an opening. And they looked down into it, and they couldn't believe what they saw. And at the same time, somebody upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery because they discovered a videotape, a VHS cassette that contained this horrible footage that effectively explained what was going on inside of that pit in the basement. But to understand that, we need to go back a year to when Sue met Jia at the train station. She went back to his house and drank the drugged tea and blacked out. After Sue drank that tea, she didn't die. Jia did not kill her. Instead, she woke up a few hours later being totally confused, and she was immediately hit by this horrible smell, but it was totally pitch black. She can't see anything, and she began feeling her hands around her, and she felt stone everywhere she touched, and eventually she realized she was in what felt like the bottom of a well. But it wasn't water she was standing in. She was standing in something that almost felt like jelly, and she began kind of touching it to figure out what it was. She could not tell, but she couldn't help but feel like the things around her were kind of moving, like they were alive. Then suddenly, a lid that clearly sat atop of this pit began to slide over above her. And so suddenly light was coming down into this pit. And at first, Sue looked up and she didn't see anything, but then she looked down and realized what was all around her. It was people. Dead people, and potentially even half alive people that were just stuffed into this big pit. They were all kind of decaying or, slowly dying or whatever it was. And she's just standing amongst it all. And then she looks up and she sees it's Jia, the beautiful man who had brought her here. He's standing up there looking down at her with a smile on his face. And Sue immediately pleads with him to please spare me, don't kill me. And Jia, he looks down at her kind of inquisitively. And he says, if I lift you out of there, will you do anything I tell you to do? And Sue said, yes, I'll do anything. Just get me out of here, please. And so Jia, he reached down, he grabbed Sue, and he pulled her up and out of this pit inside of his basement. A few days later, Sue was back at the train station where she had met Jia for the first time, but this time she was alone, and she walked up onto that train platform with no intention of riding a train. Instead, as soon as she got up there, she began looking around, and then she spotted a businessman who was sitting on a bench. And she walked over to him, and she sat down next to him, and we don't know exactly what she said, but we think what she said was something maybe sexually suggestive or, something along those lines, and she's holding his shoulders and touching his hand. She doesn't know this man, and this man is very caught off guard by this, but he's kind of going along with it, and before long, she takes this businessman's hand, they stand up, and they walk out of the train station down to the street, and they make their way a couple blocks over to Jia's house. And when they get there, Sue leads into the front door, she opens it up, she brings the man inside, the door shuts, they take their shoes off, and Sue leads this man into the kitchen where Jia is waiting with a wire between each hand. And as soon as this businessman walked into the kitchen, Jia pounced on him, wrapped the wire around his neck and held it until the man passed out. And then he released the wire. And then Gia and Sue took this man, they lifted him up, and they carried him down into the basement and laid him out on the floor. So he's not in the pit, he's just out in the middle of the basement floor. Then Gia stepped away, picked up a video camera, turned it on, and began to film. He was filming the man on the ground and also Sue. And Sue, she knew what to do. She was going to do anything she was told to do. So she climbed on top of this still very much alive businessman who's just been knocked unconscious, and she straddles him so she's looking down at his head. Then she picks up a knife and she holds it in front of her. And then she looks up at Gia, who at this point has zoomed the camera in. She can hear the sound, the mechanics inside of the camera as it's zooming in on what she's about to do. And then she raises the knife over her head and drives it into this man's chest. The video that Gia shot of Sue murdering this man was the video police found on the first floor of the house shortly after police had found this horrible pit in Gia's basement. It would turn out that Gia Wang was absolutely the serial killer who was responsible for all these people going missing from the train stations. He would abduct them just like he did Sue, and he would bring them to his house, and then he would do horrible, horrible things to them, and eventually he would chuck their bodies into this pit. And so when he abducted Sue, he actually thought that when he drugged her, that he had killed her, and he had chucked her into the pit, believing she was dead. But when Sue had woken up inside of that pit, when he opened it up and looked down, and there she was, fully alive, he had an idea. Well, why don't I turn Sue into a murderer like me? She can help me. And so that was the condition for her being pulled out of this pit, that she would assist him in murdering people, and she agreed to do it. And so the reason the profile of victims changed from sex-working women to random men is because those are the people that Sue went after. She began targeting men. And so when that elderly couple came in and reported to Officer Zhang that a man was missing, that was Sue's first victim, the man who had been seen on video being stabbed in the chest by Sue. Now, nobody to this day understands why Sue actually went along with this. Like, she was pulled up out of the pit, but then when she was told to go to the train station and find your first victim, it's unclear why she didn't just go to the police and say, hey, there's a serial killer, Gia, here's his house, here's where he is, go get him. For some reason, she just did what he said. And in fact, Sue was not the only person who was brought into this murdering scheme. He managed to convince 3 other people, including his ex-wife, to also commit murders for him. And all 3 of those people also had ample opportunity to flee and tell police, but they didn't. All of these people just did what Gia wanted without asking any questions. It was like he had absolute control over these people. That is, until that day in October of 1991, when those police officers doing a public safety check spotted Gia along with 2 accomplices fleeing with drugs. They stopped them and they got them back to the station. And one of his accomplices finally broke and told the truth. And the person who told the truth, the accomplice who broke, was Sue. She was there with him at the train station. Nobody knew she was missing. And she was the one who, when offered a blanket and was told, tell us the truth, she came clean. Ultimately, it was this police officer's kindness that broke her. In Gia's basement, inside of that horrible pit, right in the middle of it, were 42 bodies, 24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on January 24th, 1992. Today, the city of Naha is still just as infamous as it was in the 90s when these murders took place. And in fact, the nickname for Naha is now just Bandit City to reflect what happened there. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen Podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that share a theme: workplace horror stories. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Hellfire, and it's about a group of workers who were asked to make a repair inside of a very dangerous, large industrial machine. The second story you'll hear is called The Ninth Compartment, and it is a harrowing true story that was only discovered when a handwritten note was found at the bottom of the ocean. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the 5-star review button to go on a long bike ride with you, but before you leave, replace the water in their water bottles with hot dog water. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called Hellfire. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now, Daisy was pregnant, and so she and Antonio were very excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Waimama, which is a quiet rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated high school, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic, and he had the skills to do it. From the time he was a toddler, he had always been obsessed with cars, breaking apart his toy cars and putting them back together, and then as he got a little bit older, he began drawing these very intricate drawings of cars that he loved or designs for new cars. And then when he was a teenager, he began actually tinkering around with real cars until he finally acquired a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck that he tricked out with all these fancy lights and special rims and this huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. It was thanks in part to this truck, which he nicknamed Casper, that Antonio, who was too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met up with Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup for other car enthusiasts, where you could basically park your vehicle and you could walk around and see what other people did to upgrade or enhance their vehicles. And so while Antonio was there, he was walking around when he saw on the far side of this meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman, and he found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, she eventually would look up and she would smile at him, and the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, and the couple had announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby, Antonio got yet another good piece of news. He'd landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant, which was located in Apollo, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of Antonio's parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to eventually become an auto mechanic, but this job paid $12 an hour, nearly double what he was used to making. And so with this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to raise enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked at this company that this was actually a really easy job, that pretty much you just rolled around on golf carts all day picking up trash. It was perfect. A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous this thing was. It was basically this huge factory that sat right up against the water, and there were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of this factory with white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity, and they did this by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units that were inside of this factory that Antonio was looking at. And each of these units is comprised of a humongous boiler which is basically a 12-story tall oven. And so coal is loaded into this huge boiler, and it burns at the bottom of the boiler, creating some steam. And that steam goes up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, creating the electricity. And then the steam just continues up the boiler and then out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer units, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built in the 1970s, so they were older models, and they did not capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag, which basically is molten lava, like the stuff that comes out of volcanoes. That's what slag is. And so as this slag kind of builds up inside of the boiler, it would go through this man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler. And right below that hole is this 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank. And this red-hot slag, it basically dumps down into that water, which cools it off, turning it into these kind of glassy rocks. And then they settle at the bottom of this 30-foot cooling tank, and at the bottom of the cooling tank is this grinding mechanism that pulls these hardened, cooled-off little boulders of slag into it, and it crushes them up and spits them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. And then these chips get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, he hopped out of his truck, and he headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for Antonio. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety and training. And then when he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate around the inside of this huge factory, which was basically this huge maze. And he found very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work, as there were huge trucks moving around inside of it. It was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just kind of walking around and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout and also on what his job would entail. On Thursday, June 29th, so just 4 days into doing this new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood because the next day, that Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound and they were going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl, and he was very excited about this. And so Antonio came downstairs, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek, and he headed outside into his truck and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store when she pulled her phone out of her purse, and she noticed Antonio had called her and she missed it, but he had left a voicemail. And so she played the voicemail and then put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work, no problem. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially the day was like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility and picked up trash, and that was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, 2 fairly significant issues arose simultaneously inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump into the water chamber. And so as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into that chamber, and so all of this slag was just building up on top of itself inside of the boiler. And then in the water chamber, completely unconnected from the issue in the boiler, the slag that had fallen into the water chamber, that had cooled and settled at the bottom, it had landed in such a way that it actually blocked the grinding mechanism. And so none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. And so they needed to fix these 2 issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective. Now, the safe way to fix these 2 blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler. And then once it was off, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself and break up the blockage over the man-sized hole, and you could send a team into the water chamber after you drained it to chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. And so the Tampa Electric Company decided, you know what, let's just have them fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. And so at 4 in the afternoon, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. And so the plan was to empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2, and then once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that up, giving them a line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber where that grinding mechanism was, where all those slag rocks had kind of come to a stop on top of it, and they would fire water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to attempt to dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. And then after they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and they would somehow deal with the blockage inside of the boiler. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked their employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on, and in the past, nothing bad had ever happened, and so these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just totally routine, that we would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out, what they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at this plant. But either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2, and they began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just going to be there to clean up during and after the operation. And so he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back, just kind of standing back, watching the other guys do their jobs. Now, you need to understand the scale of the machinery in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and then above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. So there's coal actively burning inside of it. There's red hot slag, so like lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they are dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation begins. The senior plant manager has the water chamber drained, and then after it's empty, they open the doghouse door, and Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through the store at the big slag rocks that are sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. And it wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some progress. And Antonio likely was just kind of getting bored waiting for this to be over because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup. And then as he's standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. And so you have all this slag that's building up. It's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the weight of all that slag broke through that plug, immediately creating an opening where all this red hot slag, this lava came tumbling down. It rebounded on the back end of the empty water tank and shot out of the doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. And in seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave going over them. And then after the slag hits the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of basically lava that stretched in 40 feet in any direction. Now, unlike trying to run in, let's say, mud or deep water where you're just kind of moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, basically your foot melts into the slag. So with every step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. And so all these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and catching on fire, literally, they likely tried to start running, but it was like their bodies were slowly consumed by this slag feet first. And so Antonio tried to run like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere and he fell onto the slag. So he's laying on his side, and as he's melting and burning to death, he reaches into his pants pocket with his free hand and he pulls his phone out and he calls his mother. She doesn't pick up, and so he leaves her a voicemail, and all he says is, Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom. And in the background of this voicemail, all you hear is the hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Ninth Compartment. On the morning of August 12, 2000, 33 of Russia's best naval warships stopped inside of a particular section of the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea is this 800-mile stretch of freezing water up in the Arctic Circle just northwest of Russia, and these 33 ships were in this stretch of water for this huge military training exercise. Basically, they were going to run through some war game scenarios, where, for example, one ship would pretend to be an enemy combatant, and the other ships would work on locking onto that ship and firing at them. But of course, they wouldn't use real missiles or torpedoes, they would use duds that didn't actually explode. And so around 9 a.m., the man who was in charge of this entire operation, his name was Admiral Popov, and he was actually on board one of these 33 ships. He authorized one of the submarines that was out there to shoot 2 of their dummy torpedoes at a target, an enemy combatant, which was actually just one of the other ships. And so as soon as he did this, he was authorizing the start of this multi-day long exercise. And so all day and all night, they're doing these war game scenarios. And by the following morning, so 24 hours into this exercise, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action to speak with Russian reporters on the phone. And during this interview, he tells them that so far, the training exercise is going exactly to plan and that it looks like it will ultimately be a huge success. However, there was a problem. At the same time, Admiral Popov is giving his remarks to the reporters about how well this exercise is going, the family members of some of the crews that were out there as part of this exercise, they heard a rumor that the exercise was not going to plan, that in fact, something bad had happened to one of the ships. But none of the family members had any more information beyond that. Even though this rumor was just that, a rumor, the family members of these crews that are participating in this exercise, they naturally became very worried. And so they all, that morning, began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had originated, asking for more information. And the phone operator on the base that was receiving all of these calls that morning, at first was telling these family members that, no, nothing's going on, I haven't heard anything, there's no issues. But eventually, this phone operator let slip that, in fact, they too had heard the rumor that something bad had happened, and they think it actually might be true. But when this family member who heard this pressured the phone operator for more information, the operator clammed up and said, I can't give you anything else. And so at that point, the family member hung up the phone and called the media and told them what was going on. And the media, as soon as they had the story, they went right to Admiral Popov and they said, hey, can you address this rumor? And he didn't. He did not respond to any of the media's inquiries. And in a weird way, that was kind of reassuring to the family members of these crews because they're thinking, if Admiral Popov is just kind of ignoring this rumor and he's staying out there out on the Barents Sea still conducting this exercise, then certainly nothing bad could have happened, right? And so for the rest of that day, Sunday, the family members of these crews and the media just kind of did nothing because there wasn't anything else to do besides wait to see if there was any new news coming out of this exercise. And the following day, on Monday the 14th, so 48 hours after the start of this training exercise, there would be news. Russian officials would go on TV and they would address the rumor by saying, well, yeah, it is true. Something did happen out during this exercise. The Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines that was one of the 33 ships that was part of this exercise, they experienced some minor technical difficulties that forced them to ground their vessel at the bottom of the Barents Sea. But don't worry, this is normal. We're in touch with them through the radio. Everybody is fine. We are pumping air and power into their submarine, and before long, we will have them back on the surface. There's nothing to worry about. Now, naturally, the family members of the Kursk crew specifically, they panicked when they heard this, because even though the government is acting totally confident that everything is fine, they did not feel confident that everything was fine. Their family members are trapped on the bottom of the ocean. But at the same time, they remembered the Kursk, the actual submarine, was a very special and very safe submarine. The Kursk was quite literally Russia's best ship. They had spared no expense on it. It was extremely expensive. And it was massive. It was bigger than 2 football fields put together. And it was constructed out of this very specialized, highly reinforced steel that allowed it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep on going, no problem. It was also outfitted on the inside with all the latest and greatest technology. And so if you were going to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside of a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside of the Kursk. And so the families took solace in that. But over the next couple of days, despite the government reassuring everybody in the news that everything was fine, it's totally minor, we're going to have the Kursk up in no time, despite all that, the Kursk still had not been raised to the surface. And the government was not giving the families or the media any new information. And so in this kind of void of no real information, the families began to panic and the media began to speculate. Did the Kursk really suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something more serious? This question would be answered on August 21st, so 9 days after this training exercise had begun, when a Norwegian dive team, they were out there to assist in the recovery effort, they were able to dive down to the Kursk, and they actually got inside of the submarine through an escape hatch. An escape hatch is like this watertight closet that kind of sits on the outside of the submarine, and it allows people to go in and out of the submarine without flooding it. And once these Norwegian divers got inside of the Kursk and had a look around, they were totally shocked at what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated today, and probably will be for some time, there is one aspect of the story that is more or less universally accepted, and that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 watertight segments called compartments. Number 1 was at the front of the submarine, and then it went 2, 3, 4, all the way down to 9 in the very back of the submarine. And the reason we know what happened inside of compartment number 9 is because a 27-year-old Kursk crew member, Dmitry Kolesnikov, told us. Dmitry was born into a family of submariners. His father was a submariner, and his father's father was a submariner, and Dmitry idolized them, and so growing up, that was all he ever wanted to be. And in the late 1990s, his dream would become a reality when he commissioned as a naval officer in the Russian Navy and was given orders to serve on board the Kursk. 4 months before this training exercise out in the Barents Sea, Dmitry met and very quickly married a high school teacher named Olga, and right after their wedding, one of the first things he did is he brought her on board the Kursk for a tour. And Olga brought along a video camera and filmed her tour through the ship. And on this video, Dmitry is all smiles. He is so happy to be leading her around the ship and introducing her to people and showing her all the cramped spaces on board the submarine. It's really obvious that Dmitry was so proud of his job. Not only of his job, but also just so proud to be sharing this part of his life with his wife. Fast forward to August 12th, 2000, and Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members on board the Kursk, had just arrived at their designated section in the Barents Sea for this training exercise. And at 11:27 a.m., the captain of the Kursk came over the radio and he told Admiral Popov, who was not on the Kursk, he was on a separate ship, he told the Admiral that the Kursk was about to fire their 2 dummy torpedoes. After this call was made, the men in the first compartment of the Kursk, so at the very front of the Kursk, this is where all the torpedoes, both fake and real, are stored, they began loading these 2 dummy torpedoes. Meanwhile, Dmitry was all the way back in the 7th compartment, the engine room. That was where he was stationed. He was actually in charge of everybody who worked in the 7th compartment. And so as these 2 dummy torpedoes are being loaded, Dmitry and his men, there weren't that many of them, they were twisting dials and pulling levers, when all of a sudden there's this really loud crashing sound, and then the ship shudders and then jolts hard to one side, as if someone had grabbed the front of the submarine and just forced it to one direction. What Dmitry and the men in the 7th compartment could not have possibly known was that one of the real torpedoes in the 1st compartment had malfunctioned and it exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, how strong the exterior walls were, this torpedo, as advertised, did not puncture through it. It did a lot of damage and caused a massive fire, but the sub was not sinking. So back in the 7th compartment, Dmitry, he stands up from being jostled to the ground, and the alarms are going off, and everything is totally chaotic. Everyone's asking what's going on, and Dmitry, he takes charge, and he tells his men to follow the emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of your compartment. And so in this case, he sealed both the doors, one leading to the 6th compartment and the other leading to the 8th compartment. There's a lot of reasons for why they do this, but in essence, if there's a leak somewhere in the submarine, by sealing off your compartment, you protect yourself from being flooded. As Dmitri and his men are sealing these 2 doors, they would have begun to see and smell smoke as it came in through the ventilation ducts because there was now this uncontrolled fire raging at the front of the submarine. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle as the captain of the Kursk desperately tried to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes, and it set off this almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. Either the blast itself blew them apart, or once this hole in the front of the submarine, because the second blast did puncture the walls, once that hole was created, all this Arctic water began flooding into the submarine. So if you didn't get killed by the blast, you very quickly drowned. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were anyone in the 6th compartment going backwards, so 6, 7, 8, and 9. And so Dmitri and the other men in the 7th compartment, they would have been definitely badly shaken up from that second explosion. That completely rocked the submarine and sent them tumbling all over the place, but they would have been very alive and very aware of the terrible situation they were in. And so I would imagine that Dmitri and the others tried to grab onto any of the piping or anything they could as the submarine, because the control tower has been destroyed, just angled straight down and began careening downward. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the ocean floor 350 feet below the surface, and the back half of the Kursk came down to rest. We don't know exactly what happened on board the Kursk for those first 2 hours after they hit the ocean floor. What we do know is they had power, so there was light inside of the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite the chemicals and smoke that was in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. During those first 2 hours, we also know that at some point, Dmitri and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the 6th compartment, because remember, they had sealed off the doors both to the 8th and the 6th compartment, and so Dmitri decided to break emergency protocol, and he opened the door to the 6th compartment to allow any of the survivors that were banging on the door to come into their compartment. And when Dmitri and his men opened that door and looked into the 6th compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding, and most likely anybody forward of that compartment, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, they were already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitri and his men in the 7th compartment and the other survivors from the 6th compartment, they were forced to retreat from the 7th over to the 8th compartment and then finally into the 9th compartment because of flooding. Even though they had sealed off their watertight doors, the walls were no longer watertight because this huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all of the walls. And so it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment would fill up, it would begin leaking through all the cracks in the walls. And so Dmitri and all of the people he was with, they would have been very aware of that. And so by the time they got all the way back to the 9th compartment, the very back compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them, and they were doomed unless they got rescued or if they left out of the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitri remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper as he's sitting in this cramped 9th compartment with these 22 other men, and he writes the date and time in the corner, and then he begins to kind of describe what had happened. He talks about there being an explosion, and he thought he and these 22 men were the only survivors, and he says they're now trapped in the 9th compartment, and they have to wait for rescue. He also talks about how they had considered going out the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. After Dmitri wrote this very neat, very legible, very organized note, he folded it up and put it in his pocket, and then for the next hour and a half, he sat inside of the 9th compartment with the 22 others, and the power went out, which thrust them into absolute pitch darkness. I mean, completely black inside of there, and the temperatures, because the power was out, suddenly began to plummet, and then the worst part was the water began seeping through the walls. And so Dmitri and the other men, they would have known that it's just a matter of time before this room fills completely with water, and there is nowhere to go. And so with the water rising all around them, Dmitri pulls that paper back out of his pocket and he adds to the note. And this time, his handwriting is barely legible. And it's because he's probably suffering from hypothermia, so he's shaking. He can't see what he's writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate it's totally dark in the room. And in this second note he leaves on this piece of paper, which was dated and time-stamped an hour and a half after the first one, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear none of them think they're going to survive. Then, with the remaining space on this piece of paper, Dmitri writes this very loving and very thoughtful message to his wife and his family saying goodbye. And then his final words on this note are, "Regards to everybody, no need to despair, Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message on this note, he folded the paper up, put it in his breast pocket, and then in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 damned souls prepared to die. We don't know how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in Compartment 9, but experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded 8 hours after the initial explosion. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this case is that Dmitri and these 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response was a little bit more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of these ships, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second explosion that the Kursk experienced, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really did anything. And then when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire those 2 dummy torpedoes, everybody else, all the other ships, Admiral Popov, they all just said, you know what, I'm sure it's just their radios and they're fine and they'll be in touch soon. And so it wasn't until later that evening when the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem with the Kursk, that the Kursk has vanished. And then it would be several hours before they even got a rescue submersible in the water down to the Kursk. And then once it was down there, they could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. And so even if there were survivors inside of the submarine, they would not have been able to exit into this rescue submersible. And so for days and days, the Russians struggled to try to get inside of the submarine and kept turning down foreign aid from Norway, from America, from Great Britain. And then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sank, the Russians did accept foreign aid. And that's when the Norwegian dive team, they went down and they were able to open up the escape hatch. And when they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when ultimately Dmitri's body was found, and they found that note tucked in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. And the families of the crew of the Kursk were given 10 years' salary each. They were also given free housing in any Russian city, and their children would all have their college education paid for. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button to go on a long bike ride with you. But before you leave, replace the water in their water bottles with hot dog water. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 3 workplace horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called 90 Minutes, and it's about a man who had a terrible first day on the job. The second story you'll hear is called 18 Inches, and it's about a construction worker who lost his balance. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Robot 23, and it's about the hazards that car manufacturing workers face every day. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to do all the Amazon Music follow buttons laundry, but only dry their clothes 80% of the way. Okay, let's get into our first story called 90 Minutes. Lawrence Daquan Davis, who just went by Day, graduated from a military-style high school in 2009. Following his graduation, he enrolled in Job Corps, which offers young people from a low-income background free career education and vocational training. During his time in the Job Corps program, he trained as a medical assistant, and then after successful completion of Job Corps, he applied for numerous jobs all over the place, but no medical facility was ready to hire him. For a couple of years, Day consistently tried to apply to medical facility after medical facility, but after everybody kept denying him, mostly because he lacked experience or he lacked the credentials they were looking for, he eventually realized that, it's probably not going to happen, that he should look into some other career field. And so he decided he would join the military. But when he took the military entrance exam, he failed the math portion and so was told he can't join the military. And so Day decided he would study and retake the exam, but he knew in the meantime he needed to make money right now. He was the oldest of 4 siblings, and his mother, who had had him when she was only 14 years old, was out of work, and Day's father was not in the picture. And so Day felt like it was his responsibility to step up and help support his family. And so he did what many other people in Jacksonville, Florida did when they were struggling to find work. He went to a temp agency. Temp agencies are staffing firms that contract with employers who are in need of temporary, part-time, or seasonal workers. The temp agency hires someone like Day and then ships them off to one of their client companies when they need work. Conceptually, this employment structure works great for all parties involved. People like Day get to have a paycheck really quickly, and the companies have their short-term employment needs met on the cheap. But there's a loophole. Temp workers are legally employed by the temp agency, not by the physical location they go to do work, known as the direct employer. This is a very important distinction because it means the temp agency is the one that has to pay for insurance for the temp worker, not the direct employer. Therefore, if a temp worker gets hurt on a temporary job, the direct employer's insurance costs will not spike. Instead, the temp agency's insurance costs will spike. Meaning the direct employer knows they can be kind of reckless with their temporary workers because there's not a big penalty if they get hurt on the job. This loophole doesn't mean much if the temporary worker is being asked to be a receptionist where it's totally safe. But this loophole matters a lot when the temp worker is asked to do something dangerous, like work with industrial machinery inside of a factory. On August 16th, 2012, Day received a call back from the temp agency he went to, telling him that they had a job for him. It was at the Bacardi Bottling Corporation in Jacksonville, Florida. They told him he needed to be at the warehouse that day at 2:45 p.m. for training, and then at 3 p.m., 15 minutes later, he would start his first shift. After Day agreed to do this job and hung up with the temp agency, he excitedly called his mother to tell her that he had finally landed a real job. In fact, this would be the first job he had ever had, and so he was just very proud of himself. And his mother was very proud of him too. And so Day asked her, would you give me a ride to Walmart so I can pick up some things I need for work? I need a white shirt, I need khaki pants, I need these special industrial boots. And so his mom said, absolutely. She swung home, she picked him up. The pair went to Walmart, they picked out his whole outfit. And then from Walmart, his mother just drove him directly over to the Bacardi factory to begin his first day. Day went inside, and just a couple of minutes later at 2:45 p.m., he was shown a very short safety video. That would be all the training he received. Day was brought into Bacardi to be a warehouse clerk, which basically meant he would do odd jobs around the factory that didn't require a lot of skill. And so after he watched this training video, he was told to head down to the bottling line to watch all of the bottles as they went by to make sure the labels were put on properly. Before he headed down to the floor, Day stopped in the bathroom and took a very proud selfie of himself to commemorate the start of his first shift at his first job ever. He sent the picture to his fiancée, put the phone in his pocket, and then headed out the door down to his first workstation. There was a section of the factory that initially Day was not working in, where there were these huge machines called palletizers that took the finished bottles of rum and stacked them into what are called pallets so they could be shipped off the stores. These palletizers are two-story pieces of heavy machinery where the top story is just catwalks where the palletizer operator can manipulate the machines, and then the first floor is where the rum actually comes into the machine and is moved around and stacked on these big metal platforms. Sometimes as the rum comes in on the conveyor belt, they will fall off and smash on the ground. This started to happen about 90 minutes after Day took that selfie in the bathroom. The palletizer operator, after seeing the broken glass, called out over the radio that he needed a temp worker to come into that section of the factory and help him. Day's supervisor at the bottling line told Day to stop what he was doing and go over and help pick up the glass. There is a security camera video of Day running into the section of the factory where all the palletizers are, making himself obviously available to help pick up this glass. And the operator sees him and immediately turns, he's up on the catwalk, and he points down towards the first floor, clearly telling Day, you need to get down there, that's where the glass is, go sweep it up. Day immediately walks around and goes down to the first floor of this machine and begins working. A couple of minutes later, Day comes back up to the catwalk, and he looks visibly confused. He's scratching his head, and just everything about his body language says something is wrong. Now, we don't know for sure what Day says next because there's no audio in this video, but he's clearly asking a question to the operator and also to a supervisor who's now in frame. And it looks very much like he's asking clarifying questions, like he's confirming, you want me to go down there, right into that space down there and clean the glass up? That's what you want me to do? And clearly the operator and the supervisor have no time for questions from Day. They just want him to get this done. And so there's kind of a tense interaction between the two parties before Day ultimately just decides, okay, I'll just go down and do what they asked me to do. And so Day again goes back around and you see him go down into the first floor to continue cleaning this glass. And after a few moments, the supervisor and the operator, who don't realize Day is still down there, they turn the machine back on. And after a couple of seconds, they hear a scream coming from the first floor. They look over the railing down there and they see Day. The broken glass that needed to be cleaned up was located directly underneath this metal platform that lowered the built pallets that weighed 2,000 pounds all the way down to the floor before they were shipped off and out the door. In order for Day to actually get down in there and clean this glass up, he needed to crouch way down and practically crawl on his stomach to get into this tight space. While he was in there, the machine turned back on again, and he wasn't able to crawl out fast enough before this platform and 2,000 pounds of rum pressed him into the ground. It would be the equivalent of crawling on your stomach into the bottom of an elevator shaft and then having the elevator car come down and mechanically be lowered flush to the bottom with you in there. The palletizer operator and the other supervisor immediately spring into action and try to reverse this platform up off of Day, but they can't do it, and so they grabbed a metal pry bar and they tried to pry the platform off of him, but that didn't work either. And so finally, when emergency crews did show up and were able to get this platform up off of Day, it was too late. He was already dead. In any factory where a worker needs to go inside of a machine that could maim or kill them if it turned on, they go through what's called a lockout or tagout procedure before stepping foot inside. All it is they completely incapacitate that machine. Day had no idea about lockout tagout procedures because the only training he got was a 15-minute video that didn't touch on them. And so although Day definitely had reservations about going down underneath this machine, he wanted to make a good first impression on his first day of work at his first job ever. And so he pushed his reservations aside and went down below, believing the supervisor and the operator were looking out for him. when in reality, they, like all of the other managers and supervisors inside of this warehouse, had been trained to prioritize productivity over safety. And so while they definitely knew the lockout tagout procedures, they chose not to do them because that slowed down productivity. And so in this unfortunate example where Day is kind of like a second-class citizen within the Bacardi plant because he's a temp worker, his safety was thrown out the window in favor of reaching a quota, and it got him killed. Bacardi was ultimately fined $192,000, but after they improved their safety compliance, their fine was reduced to $110,000. Bacardi also paid Day Davis's family $250,000. The staffing agency that employed Davis was not hit with any fines, and to this day, they are still sending temp workers to the Bacardi bottling factory. Our next story is called 18 Inches. On August 15, 2003, 41-year-old veteran construction worker Ron Hunt was part of a crew that was building a house in Reno, Nevada. On that particular day, Ron knew before he could do anything else on the job site, the first thing he needed to do was drill a couple of large holes in the ceiling of one of the rooms in this house. And so as soon as he got to the job site that morning, he went in the back of his truck and pulled out a 6-foot-tall stepladder and a drill, and then walked into that particular room. Once inside, he opened up his stepladder and placed it where he wanted it, and then he tested his drill by squeezing the trigger a couple of times, and so once he knew that worked, he climbed up the ladder a couple of steps, not to the very top, but just a couple of steps, and began punching holes in the ceiling with this drill. Now, at first, these holes were very easy to punch through. But when he got down and moved the ladder to another section of this room where he also needed holes in the ceiling, when he got up there, he could not get the drill to go through the ceiling. He didn't really get it because he knew there was nothing behind the ceiling that would stop the drill from going through, and it was just wood, so it really should be going through. And so he decided he just needed a little bit of extra leverage. He needed to really press on the back of this drill while he's pulling the trigger. And so instead of standing on the second or third rung of the 6-foot-tall stepladder, he walked to the very top of the ladder, the kind of dangerous section you're not supposed to stand on any ladder. And from there, he was in a better position to really push this drill into the ceiling. And so he gets in position and kind of feels like the ladder's fairly stable, and then he lines up this drill where he wants it. He begins squeezing the trigger, and at the same time, he really pushes with all that extra leverage into the ceiling. And as he does that, he feels the drill starting to go into the wood, but at the same time, he's pushing so hard that he's not realizing he's pushing down with his feet at a bit of an angle. And at some point, he pushes too hard, and he causes the ladder to spill out from underneath him. Ron instinctively tried to throw the drill away from him, which is a common practice amongst construction workers. You don't want to land on your gear, it could hurt you. But he wasn't able to throw the drill far enough away from him, and even worse, the drill, when it hit the ground, basically right underneath him, it landed on its back with the drill bit pointing straight up into the air. And so when he fell down face first, his right eye socket landed directly on the drill. And so this 18-inch long, 1.5-inch in diameter drill bit impales his head, goes right through his eyeball, goes through his skull, and punctures out the back of his head. And so Ron, he hits the ground, but he's conscious, and so without even rolling over, he just reaches up with his hands and he feels the base of this drill, and then he traces to the drill bit, and he feels it going into his eye, and then he feels around the back of his head, and he feels the rest of the drill coming out of his skull. And at that point, he just starts screaming. The only other worker on the job site at the time was this man named Forrest, and Forrest, who was in a separate part of the job site, he hears Ron screaming, and so he runs over, he goes in the room, and he sees Ron, who's now standing up, cradling the drill base. The bit, the 18-inch bit, is still poking through his head, and so Ron is looking at Forrest and then turns to the side to show him that he's been fully impaled by this thing, and Forrest is totally horrified at what he's seeing. He can't believe Ron is even alive, but then Forrest jumps into action. He rips his shirt off, runs over to Ron, and kind of wraps it around his head to try to control the bleeding a little bit, and then he tells Ron to stay where he is, and then Forrest ran out of the job site, ran about 1,000 feet away to the nearest house, and he was able to use their phone to call paramedics. The paramedics arrive in an ambulance a few minutes later, and they find Ron sitting next to Forrest, just with this drill still in his face. Ron is very obviously in shock because he's not making any sound. He's totally conscious, but he's just kind of staring blankly, holding on to this thing. And so the paramedics, they go over and they detach the drill base from the drill bit. So all that's left is the actual 18-inch rod that's been pushed through his head. And then they take Ron via ambulance to a local hospital. And from there, they actually fly him in a helicopter to a bigger hospital that can handle this kind of injury. And so when he arrives at this larger hospital, they rush him immediately to the operating room. And at first, the surgeons attempted to cut off either end of this bit, the part that's sticking out the front of his eye and the part that's sticking out the back of his head. But they realized once they did that, there would still be this huge piece of bit that was stuck in his skull, and that would obviously be a huge problem. And so after thinking about it, they decided their best bet was just to unscrew the bit from his head. And so they gave him some morphine, and then over the next couple of hours, the doctors slowly twisted this piece of metal until it finally unwound itself out of his skull. And apparently, as they were doing that, Ron, who was so high on painkillers, was cracking jokes about how somebody needs to come in here and take a picture of me. I probably look so great. And so miraculously, Ron would survive, and he would not even be paralyzed. The worst thing that happened to him is he lost the sight in his right eye, but all things considered, Ron is okay with that. The surgeons would tell Ron that the only reason he didn't die or get paralyzed is because when that drill bit went into his skull, it kind of pressed his brain aside as it passed through. Had it punctured his brain when it went through, that almost certainly would have killed him, but by some unbelievably slim chance, it did not, and he survived. The next and final story of today's episode is called Robot 23. In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of sites around the United States, executives from the German car company Mercedes-Benz had finally come to their decision. Tuscaloosa, Alabama would become the site of the first ever passenger car assembly factory outside of Germany. This was a historic day, not just for Mercedes, but also for Alabama. At the time, the state had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and so residents of Alabama were hopeful this factory would create hundreds of new jobs. But what actually happened shattered their expectations. Immediately following this announcement by Mercedes that they were going to set up shop in Tuscaloosa, 3 other major automotive giants, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, all announced that they too would be setting up shop in Alabama. And so these 4 major factories all came with jobs of their own, and each of these factories attracted dozens of other smaller factories that supplied the parts to put together these cars. And so all these smaller factories came with additional jobs. And so this one decision by Mercedes didn't just create hundreds of new jobs in Alabama. It created tens of thousands of new jobs all across the state. 2 years later, in 1995, a little girl named Regina Elsie was born just about an hour away from the Mercedes factory in Tuscaloosa. Growing up, the automotive manufacturing industry was a big part of her life. Her family worked in the factories, and as a kid, every day when she went outside, she would see dozens of these 18-wheelers come bombing down the road in front of her house, carrying car parts on their way to one of the many factories. Regina was a reserved and quiet kid. She loved to read, she was a good student, and she loved animals. She would take in stray animals. Any animal she could find, she would bring it back home to her house, but her favorite animal was her dog, who she named Cow. She dreamed of becoming a pediatrician, and so after high school, she enrolled in a local community college on a federal grant with plans to eventually transfer out to Auburn University, where she would finish her degree and then hopefully go on to medical school. But while she was at the community college, she fell in love with a local boy named Dan, who she'd actually gone to kindergarten with. And before long, the two were engaged to be married. The young couple wanted to move in together, but they didn't have enough money. Regina was a full-time student, so she didn't have an income, and Dan barely made minimum wage working as a shelf stalker at Walmart. The only way they could get their own place would be if Regina dropped out of school and got a job too. This was a difficult decision for Regina because she still wanted to be a pediatrician, but at the same time, she was really excited about her future with Dan, and so she thought, I'm only 20 years old, I can always come back and get my education later and become a doctor later, and so in January of 2016, she disenrolled from her classes and went out looking for a job. A month later, she landed a job as an assembly line worker at a car parts supplier factory where her stepfather and one of her sisters currently worked. It was called Agen USA, and they supplied parts to Hyundai and to Kia. Regina's mother told her that it was not a great place to work. that she had worked at 2 other similar auto parts supplier factories, and the pace and pressure was unbearable. Car part suppliers are known for being under intense pressure to reach their quotas every single day. Failure to do so, even by a slim margin, can lead to massive fines imposed on them by their customers, like in this case, Hyundai and Kia. This immense pressure on these suppliers often leads them to overwork their employees, like Regina. And the employees develop a sort of production at all costs mentality because they see their employer only cares about hitting their daily quota. And so employees will cut corners and skirt safety regulations to ensure they stay on their quota. But after Regina's mother approached her and told her about all these horrible things about the auto parts supplier factories, Regina said, "I got bills to pay." She'd already moved into a house in southeastern Alabama near the Agen factory. She was living there with her fiancé Dan and her beloved dog Cow. She had bought herself a brand new car, which she was very proud of, and she had found herself the perfect wedding dress that fit her just right, but it cost $4,000. And so Regina was not about to walk away from this job. She needed the money. When she first started at Agen, she was put on temporary status, which meant she only made $8.75 an hour. In order for her to make more money, she would need the company to shift her to full-time status, which came with a $1.75 per hour raise. Determined to show the company she was worthy of being shifted to that full-time status, Regina volunteered for 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. But by June of that year, after 6 months of this hellacious work schedule, Regina was over it. And she went to her parents' house, she laid on the couch, and she told them that she just couldn't do it anymore. And in fact, she was going to start looking for other work, preferably something she could do part-time, so she could go back to school and continue to pursue her career as a pediatrician. And her family was relieved and excited to see her get her life back to normal. A few days later, on June 18th, Regina, who was still employed at Agen, was working the day shift at the factory. Her job that day was to oversee a robot that would weld on these metal pillars onto the front right and the front left of the car where the side view mirrors would attach to. This robot looked like a giant arm protruding from the ground, where at the end of the arm, where the hand would be, were 2 welding tips that stuck out about 4 inches each. The robot was surrounded by this huge chain-link fence that was there specifically to keep the employees from getting too close to it while it was in operation. Regina would oversee this robot via a computer screen outside of that cage. At some point in the afternoon, as Regina is monitoring her computer, it comes across the screen that there is a stud fault on Robot 23. Now, her robot was not Robot 23, it was the robot adjacent to her station, but the person in charge of overlooking Robot 23 was a part of her team, and her team had a daily quota to hit. And so having Robot 23 down directly impacted Regina. And so Gina stepped away from her computer, she walked over to the outside of Robot 23, she spoke to the team member, and they decided it was best to just call maintenance and have them come by and try to clear the fault. A security camera inside of the factory was aimed down at Regina and her coworkers as they stood outside of the metal cage around Robot 23 waiting for maintenance. But after quite a while, maintenance still hadn't shown up, and it was obvious the team was getting very anxious. They know every second that robot was not operational, they were hurting their chances of reaching their quota, which the company would be very upset about because they'd be hit with a big fine. And so at some point, Regina just kind of says, "Screw it, I'm going to fix the fault myself." And so she picks up a small tool that looks like a screwdriver, she opens up the cage to Robot 23, and she steps inside and walks right for the stem of the robot. When she gets over to it, she has her back to the robot's arm that's behind her, and she begins doing something with her tool to the stem of the robot. And whatever she does, it works because the robotic arm behind her springs into life and immediately goes back into the action it had been trying to perform before it failed. And that action involved swinging back in Regina's direction. And when it did, those 2 4-inch welding tips at the end of the robotic arm were driven directly into Regina's back, impaling her. Her coworkers saw it happen and hit the emergency shutoff switch, but it didn't power down the robot until after it had thrust Regina across the cage and pinned her up against the wall. And so with this robot now powered down, the welding tips were now run all the way through her upper back and pressed up against the wall. She was literally pinned to the wall like tacking up a piece of paper with 2 tacks in a corkboard. She slouched over, but her eyes were wide open. She was conscious, but she didn't make a sound. Nobody knew how to release Regina from the robot's grasp. And so the team leader hopped on a forklift and sped across the factory floor towards the break room. He ran inside, he found a maintenance worker, and he dragged him out. They got on the forklift. The maintenance worker had to sit on the team leader's lap, and they sped back across the factory towards the Robot 23 cage. When they got there, they took this maintenance guy and basically thrust him into the cage and told him to get Regina out. But the maintenance worker didn't speak any English. He was terrified at what he was seeing Regina the way she was. He didn't really know how to fix the situation. Tempers were flaring, and before long, the maintenance worker just got overwhelmed and ran away. When emergency crews finally arrived several minutes later, Regina was still pinned by this robot. She was conscious, her eyes were wide open, and she was still totally silent. And they were able to get her off. They sent her to a hospital, and then she was transported to a trauma center, but it was too late. The damage that had been done to her by getting impaled by this robot was just too extensive, and she died at the hospital. It would turn out Regina's company, Agent, had not properly trained her or any of her coworkers. Agent's policy was to hire people and as fast as possible, get them on the floor, helping them reach their quota. And so as a result, Regina and her team members had no idea about a so-called lockout procedure, where if you're going to go inside one of these robots' cages, you need to make sure the power switch has been locked out, meaning it will not turn back on if you fix the fault that has caused your robot to stop. All Regina and her coworkers knew is that the most important thing is hitting your quota at the end of the day. And so that was the reason Regina went inside of the cage, and that was the reason Regina was killed. Agent ultimately pleaded guilty to not having properly trained Regina, leading to her death, and they paid the family $1.5 million. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to do all the Amazon Music follow buttons laundry, but only dry their clothes 80% of the way. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 3 workplace horror stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Scavenger, and it's about a sailor who went missing right before departure. The second story you'll hear is called Wrong Door, and it's about a construction worker who went missing after taking a wrong turn. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Bones, and it's about an electrician who was lured into an abandoned tunnel. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the Amazon Music follow button a scoop of their favorite ice cream, but slip an elephant laxative into it first. Okay, let's get into our first story called Scavenger. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his third deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Curate, along with 7 people under his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Curate called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Curate. But ultimately, they got it done, and Curate cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Curate undid the 3 dogs on his hatch, and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight, and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Curate crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch, he undid the 3 dogs, he opened up the hatch, and then using a remote-controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Curate could inspect them through the scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Curate just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Curate was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Curate, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Curate's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Curate. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Curate. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower 2 dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the 2 lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Curate could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside, and so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up the scavenger air recovery hatches, and it wasn't the sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Curate. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower 2 dogs, and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Curate's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman completely independently had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it. And he unlocked the 3 dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all 3 dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit. And he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Curate wasn't in there. And you just checked, right? He's not in there. And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there. It's all good. And so the 2 of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Curate continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around? And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Curate. And so finally 9:30 came around, and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave even though they had no idea where Curate was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Curate must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second-guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone. Even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found, and so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you gotta figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is gonna become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's gonna happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive. Our next story is called Wrong Door. On August 14th, 2012, Celestino Cervantes picked up 28-year-old Victor Diaz for work. Celestino was an expert roofer, and he had just hired Victor to come on his crew and help him with a particular job. This was going to be Victor's first day as a roofer, but for the past 10 years he had worked in construction, so he was familiar with the operation. The two men arrived at their job site in San Antonio, Texas around 8 a.m. that morning. They were in charge of putting a new roof on a 115-year-old building that was being redeveloped into a fancy steakhouse. Until 2001, this building had been used by a brewing company to house their enormous boilers. As such, this building was referred to as the boiler house. Protruding from the boiler house roof was this large metal duct that was 15 feet long and almost looked like a covered walkway, and it connected to the side of this huge smokestack. This duct and smokestack used to be how the built-up condensation inside the boiler house was able to travel up and out of the building. When the two roofers got out of their truck, Celestino told Victor to take his tools and make his way up to the roof of the boiler house and get to work, and that he had a few things he had to do down on the ground floor, but he would be up to check on him in a little bit. Celestino turned around and was fiddling with his equipment inside of the truck, while Victor made his way into the building and out of sight. An hour and a half later, Celestino went up to the roof to check on Victor, but he couldn't find Victor anywhere, and he couldn't find his tools anywhere. So Celestino went back down into the main section of this building where other contractors that were working on this renovation were, and he began asking them, hey, have you seen this guy, Victor? He works with me, I can't find him, and no one had seen him. And so Celestino's thinking to himself, well, I guess Victor must have left, but that didn't really make any sense because Victor didn't have a vehicle and he didn't live nearby. But Celestino's thinking, you know what, maybe somebody came and picked him up. Now, unfortunately, Victor did not carry a cell phone, so nobody had any way of getting directly in contact with him. So Celestino leaves the building and he calls Victor's brother and he asks him, have you seen Victor? Do you know where he might have gone? And Victor's brother says, no, I haven't seen him since this morning when he left with you. So Victor's brother began calling around to friends and family and asked them if they had seen Victor, but nobody knew where he was. So for the rest of the day, Celestino and the rest of Victor's friends and family, they went out looking for Victor at the job site and around the surrounding areas, but there was just no sign of him. And so that night, Victor's brother went to the police to file a missing person report. But the police told him that it was really too early to file a report because Victor was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, and that he should just come back in a day or two if Victor still has not shown up. 2 days go by and Victor had still not shown up, so Victor's sister-in-law went back to the police and says, okay, now I want to file a missing person report. We don't know where he is, no one can get in touch with him, we need your help. But the officer she spoke to told her that she still needed to wait another 5 days to process this request. It would turn out this was just not true. It was a mistake. There was no arbitrary waiting period to file a missing person report. So without any help from the police, Victor's friends and family and coworkers spent the next several days scouring San Antonio, scouring the job site, looking everywhere for him and handing out flyers and asking people if they'd seen him, but no one had. He had just disappeared. By Monday the following week, so 6 days after Victor has gone missing, his family had printed out dozens of these huge posters with his face on them and a number to call if you had any information about him, and their plan was to distribute them the following morning all over San Antonio. But the following morning, before they headed out, they got a call. Victor had been found. 7 days earlier, when Celestino told Victor to head inside and make his way to the roof and begin the project, Victor had gotten his tools, gone inside, he made his way up the stairwell to the second floor, and then he made a series of odd decisions. Instead of making his way to the access door and climbing his way up to the roof, he went to the far side of the second floor where there were all these wooden barriers preventing people from going any farther. He climbed over all these barriers and he reached the entrance to that huge duct where the condensation used to go. And so from his perspective, he would have been looking into this duct and it would have been completely pitch black because it connected to that smokestack and the smokestack was totally sealed off. But despite not having any idea where this tunnel goes, and it clearly not being the place Celestino told him to go, Victor decides to just get into this tunnel, which required bending over because it was only 4 feet tall and 5 feet wide. So he gets inside of this tunnel and he begins shuffling his way deeper and deeper into this tunnel until he reaches the end of the tunnel where it actually connects into the smokestack. Now, at the top of this duct, where it connects to the smokestack, there wasn't a grate or bars or any sort of barrier that would stop you from spilling into the smokestack. And because it was totally pitch black, Victor, when he made it to the edge of that duct, he just kept on walking and fell 20 feet down to the bottom of the smokestack. And so in total darkness, Victor, who was probably badly hurt from the fall, began feeling around the inside of the chimney looking for a way out. And he eventually found a hatch that was big enough for him to fit through. But when he felt up against it, he realized it was locked from the outside and it wouldn't even budge. He couldn't even get light to come in through a crack. It was totally sealed off. And that was the only way out of the smokestack unless he could get back up to the duct. But there was no way to do that. He most likely began screaming for help, but he was encased in thick brick, and so his sound wouldn't have traveled. It would have been completely muffled. Plus, the smokestack was fairly far away from the job site, which was very noisy as it is, and so there was just no way they could have heard him. And the smokestack and the duct were not part of the renovation, and so there was absolutely no foot traffic over around the smokestack. He was completely alone, no one knew he was there, and there was no way out. 7 days after Victor fell into the smokestack, workers over at the job site, they noticed this huge swarm of flies over around the base of the smokestack. There were so many flies over there, they decided they had to go investigate. And so as they walked closer and closer to the smokestack, they were hit with this overwhelming stench of death and decay. And then when they got to the smokestack, they could see the flies were centralized on that hatch at the bottom. And so they cut the lock, they opened it up, and inside they found Victor's body. And they saw his hands were badly bloodied and bruised, and they were pressed up against the inside of the hatch, indicating in his final moments he was desperately trying to open that hatch and save himself, but there was just no way to do that. Although no one knows this for sure, it's believed Victor confused the condensation duct with the access point to the roof. The next and final story of today's episode is called Bones. In 2017, an electrician named Pete had become accustomed to doing work in basements and sub-basements of older buildings in Baltimore, Maryland. He discovered that many times when he worked in a stretch of older buildings right next to each other, that in the basement or sub-basement, there would be a stretch of tunnel that connected each building to each other, kind of like a common door in a hotel room. One day, Pete was asked to install some new lights in the sub-basements of 3 very old buildings that were all right next to each other. Apparently, someone had purchased the entire building complex after they had sat there abandoned for some time. When Pete arrived, his foreman, whose name was Mike, was waiting for him outside the farthest east building. And so Pete got out, walked up to the building, and Mike led him down to the basement and then down another flight of stairs into the sub-basement. The first thing Pete did was pull his flashlight out and look around and see if there was a tunnel connecting to the adjoining buildings, because if there was, it would make his life a lot easier. And sure enough, he shined his light to the west and there was a tunnel. And so he knew he wouldn't need to lug his gear up and over after he was done with each building. After that, Pete and Mike set up floodlights inside of that first sub-basement they were going to be working in, and then they put their gear on and they got to work. After a few hours of Pete being really focused on what he was working on, he looked up and realized Mike was gone, and he assumed he must have gone upstairs for a lunch break. And Pete, who had had a really big breakfast, wasn't that hungry, but wanted to take a break, so he decided instead of eating, he would just go explore the other sub-basements. So Pete walked over to that first tunnel that went into the second building. He walked through it. It wasn't very far, maybe 5 or 6 feet to get into the next building. Once he got into that second building, it was totally dark because neither he nor Mike had actually gotten in there yet. And so Pete pulled his flashlight out and he scanned around the room, and he saw directly on the other side, still going west across the building complex, was yet another tunnel connected to the third and final building. And so Pete walked through the second sub-basement, shining around, looking for anything interesting. There was nothing down there. He got to that tunnel, he walked through, and he entered into the third and final room of the entire building complex. And so he lifted his flashlight up and he scanned around the room, and he was shocked when on the other side, still going west, as if there was a fourth building, there was another tunnel. Pete kept his flashlight trained on this tunnel, and he's thinking to himself, did I get something wrong here? Is there really 4 buildings? Because I'm almost positive there was 3. There shouldn't be a tunnel over there because there's no more buildings. And so he's really intrigued, and so he keeps his flashlight up and he starts walking across the room towards this tunnel, and he gets about halfway across this sub-basement when he hears someone's voice come out of this mysterious tunnel. And it sounds an awful lot like Mike's. And Pete would say that his initial reaction to this was, oh, I guess Mike must have had his lunch break and then come back down here and started doing the same thing I'm doing, exploring the other sub-basements. And so he's already checked out this tunnel and he wants to show me what's down there. So Pete walks over to this tunnel and he shines his light inside, and right away he can tell it's different than the other 2 tunnels he's walked through, because those went straight across, and this tunnel he's looking at goes down and kind of bends off to the right. And so totally unconcerned, because he believes Mike is down there already, he starts walking down this winding tunnel. After walking for a couple of minutes just straight down into this tunnel, he finally walks into this huge room with 20-foot high ceilings, and he lifts his flashlight up and he looks around and there's no Mike, and he yells out for him. He doesn't hear him, but he noticed in the middle of the room were all these small animal skeletons that had been arranged in a big triangle on the ground. And as he scanned across the ground with his light, he came to the right side of the room at one of the points of the triangle. And at the top of that point was this large dog-like skeleton lying on the ground. It looked as if the triangle was more like an arrow, and it was pointed at this one large dog. Pete went back to looking around the room, and he saw right across from him was another tunnel entrance into more unexplored passageway. And for a second he thought about just turning around and leaving, because this whole thing was starting to give him the creeps. But then he heard what sounded like Mike's voice again calling from that unexplored tunnel. And so he decided, okay, I'll walk a little bit farther to see what Mike wants. And so Pete carefully walked across this room, being careful not to step on any of the bones. And right before he walked into this new tunnel, he pulled his phone out in case he might have service and he could just call Mike and see what he wanted. But he had no service on his phone, so he entered the new tunnel. Unlike the other tunnel that went down the whole time, this new tunnel was totally flat, but it was a little bit more narrow. And so as he's walking, it's kind of zigging and zagging, and it's just getting a little bit tight on his shoulders as he's moving. And after a couple of minutes of walking and yelling out for Mike and not hearing from him, he just stops and he just thinks, is this a good idea? Should I keep walking down this strange tunnel, or should I just go back and meet Mike back up in the sub-basement? And as he's standing there facing away from the direction he just came, he thinks he hears something behind him. So Pete turns around and shines his light, and there's no one there. He yells out for Mike, and Mike doesn't yell back. And then Pete hears the faint clicking sound of something moving on all fours in the chamber he had just come from. And he's thinking to himself, what could have gotten down here? There's only one way in, and I've taken the other tunnel. Did I miss some dog that was staying in the middle there? I think I would have seen an animal that was moving around. And so as he's thinking about this, he realizes the clicking sounds have stopped. It's gone completely silent. And so he stops, and he's just intently listening. And then all of a sudden, whatever it is out there starts running at full speed down the tunnel towards Pete. And so Pete immediately turns around and starts sprinting down this unexplored tunnel. All he hears behind him is this animal at full sprint, grunting and bouncing into walls as it gains on him. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, Pete gets to the end of this tunnel and he sees it's a small flight of stairs to a large metal door. He runs up and he grabs the door and he tries to open it, and it opens. He runs outside, pulls it shut, hears it click, and then he sinks down with his back against the door, pressing up against it to ensure it stays shut. And as Pete is sitting there, he hears this thing come barreling into the room where this door is, and it rams into the door, and he feels it shake the door forward, but the door holds. And then whatever it was just lost interest, turned around, and left. Even though this animal appeared to be gone and the door appeared to hold, Pete stayed sitting with his back up against the door for a couple of minutes while he composed himself. He really didn't know what to make of what just happened, because he's thinking to himself, that animal had to have been huge. It just nearly barreled this door down. I felt the whole door shake. I mean, if that's a dog, that is a huge dog. And also, where's Mike? Mike's the whole reason I went into this tunnel in the first place. He was calling to me, or so I thought he was, and I never saw him. And so Pete's totally confused and he's traumatized and he's looking around and he's finally taking stock of where he is, and he realizes he's under one of the docks of what would turn out to be the Four Seasons Hotel, which meant he was at least about a half-mile away from where he had started in the sub-basement of those buildings. Pete stood up and made his way up to the sidewalk where he called Mike. And Mike was very confused at what Pete was telling him, because he said, I never went into that tunnel. I never went into the other sub-basements. At my lunch break, I just went upstairs and got a bite to eat, and when I came down, you were gone. And so Pete started talking about the animal he saw, and as he was describing it, he's thinking to himself how crazy he must sound, and he began to realize that it had to be, a stray dog got in there, and he just must not have seen it, and that was it. And so after they hang up, Pete is left thinking to himself, if that was a stray dog, then what were those bones arranged in that triangle for? And why did they seem to be an arrow pointing at that other bigger dog? And also, who was yelling to me inside of the tunnel if it wasn't Mike? But when Pete and Mike got back to those old buildings, they did not do any more exploration. It was like they were just not going to talk about what happened. Instead, they put a fold-up table in front of that tunnel that led down to the room filled with bones and whatever animal was down there, and they rushed the job in all the sub-basements, got all the lights up as fast as they could. The last thing they did was they moved the table back out of the way and then ran up out of the building and never looked back. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer the Amazon Music follow button a scoop of their favorite ice cream, but slip an elephant laxative into it first. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. If you want to check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on at Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.